Picture this. It's the ultimate medieval showdown that history never gave us. On one side, you've got Viking warriors, bearded death machines from the frozen north, who've been terrorizing Europe for centuries. On the other side, Crusader knights, armored killing machines blessed by God and trained from childhood to be the perfect soldiers. This isn't just any fantasy battle. This is the clash between two completely different philosophies of warfare, two radically different approaches to being the most dangerous human beings alive. And the question that's been burning in history buffs' minds for generations is this: if these two legendary warrior cultures had met in their prime, really met, at full strength, who would have walked away from the battlefield? Let's settle this once and for all. Vikings versus Crusaders, the ultimate medieval deathmatch. But before we can determine who'd win this epic confrontation, you need to understand what we're really dealing with here. These aren't just two groups of guys with swords. We're talking about warriors who represent the absolute peak of medieval combat effectiveness, fighters whose very names struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. First, let's talk about the Vikings. And right off the bat, let's destroy some Hollywood myths. The Viking Age ran roughly from the 790s to the late 11th century, and during that time, these Scandinavian raiders proved they were very successful in raiding coastal towns and monasteries due to their efficient warships and intimidating war tactics, skillful hand-to-hand combat, and fearlessness. Think about that last part, fearlessness. We're not talking about courage here. We're talking about warriors who genuinely didn't seem to care whether they lived or died, as long as they died gloriously in battle. The Viking belief system literally taught them that dying in combat was the best possible fate, that falling in battle would earn them a place in Valhalla, where they'd feast and fight for eternity. This wasn't just religious conviction. This was a cultural death cult that produced some of the most psychologically dangerous warriors in human history. And here's the key part. Courage, camaraderie, and a lack of chivalry made the Norse fearsome fighters. That lack of chivalry part? Crucial. Vikings didn't fight fair. They fought to win, by any means necessary. Now, let's examine their weapons and tactics. In the Viking Age, a number of different types of weapons were used: swords, axes, bows and arrows, lances and spears. The Vikings also used various aids to protect themselves in combat: shields, helmets, and chainmail. But it's not just what they carried, it's how they used it. The Viking battle axe wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool of psychological warfare. These weren't the clunky weapons you see in movies. Viking axes were perfectly balanced instruments of death that could cleave through shields, armor, and bone with devastating efficiency. A skilled Viking warrior could swing an axe in patterns so complex and unpredictable that enemies couldn't follow the weapon's path until it was buried in their skull. But the real terror of Viking warfare was their tactical innovation: the shield wall. Shields were essential for forming the shield wall, a formation where warriors stood side by side as they locked shields in order to create a defensive barrier. This tactic was especially effective during the early stages of battle. Picture this: dozens of Vikings standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to create an impenetrable wall of wood and iron, while axes and spears thrust out like the spines of some massive deadly creature. Within the wall, fighters typically operated in pairs, perhaps as father and son, blood brothers. This wasn't just military organization. This was family fighting together, each man willing to die for the warrior next to him. The psychological bond that held the shield wall together was stronger than steel. And then there were the berserkers, the stuff of nightmares. Viking berserkers, legendary warriors known for their battle frenzy, unmatched strength, and brutal combat tactics, represented the absolute extreme of Viking warrior culture. These were men who worked themselves into supernatural rages before battle, fighting with such fury that they seemed inhuman to their enemies. One of these is naked apart from a horned helmet and a belt in which a sword is placed. He holds a lance in each hand. Think about the psychological impact of facing warriors who threw off their armor and fought nearly naked, screaming like demons and showing no fear of death whatsoever. But now let's talk about their opponents, the Crusader knights. These weren't just random medieval soldiers. These were the elite of elite, the special forces of medieval Christianity, warriors whose entire existence was dedicated to perfecting the art of armored combat. The Crusader armor pioneered advancements such as reinforced chainmail and early plate elements, setting standards for personal protection. Over time, these designs were adapted and refined, influencing late medieval armor with increased mobility and protection. We're talking about military technology that was centuries ahead of what most other warriors could access. The evolution of Crusader equipment was driven by one simple reality. They were fighting for their lives in the Holy Land against some of the most skilled warriors on Earth. Every piece of gear, every tactical innovation, every training method was tested in battle against enemies who were just as motivated and just as deadly as they were. The shift from chainmail to plate armor laid the foundation for contemporary body armor concepts, which prioritize both protection and mobility. This wasn't just heavy metal clothing. This was sophisticated military engineering that could stop arrows, deflect sword blows, and absorb impacts that would shatter bones. But here's where it gets interesting. The medieval knight was usually a mounted and armored soldier, often connected with nobility or royalty. Crusader knights weren't just better equipped than Vikings. They were professional soldiers from a completely different social class, men who'd been trained from childhood in the arts of war and had access to the finest weapons and armor that medieval technology could produce. The fundamental difference between Vikings and Crusaders comes down to this. Vikings were raiders and berserkers whose strength lay in surprise, psychological warfare, and their willingness to die for glory. Crusaders were professional soldiers whose strength lay in superior equipment, training, and coordinated tactics. So who would win? Let's game this out. In a one-on-one fight, the Crusader knight has overwhelming advantages. His armor could stop most Viking weapons, while his sword and training would let him exploit the gaps in lighter Viking protection. The Viking's best chance would be to use his axe to try to crush the knight's armor through sheer impact, but that's assuming he could get close enough to land a blow against a mounted opponent with a 12-foot lance. But medieval battles weren't fought as individual duels. They were massive, chaotic melees, where tactics and morale often mattered more than individual skill. And here's where things get complicated. The Viking shield wall was one of the most effective infantry formations in medieval warfare. A disciplined formation of Vikings could potentially stop a cavalry charge that would scatter most other foot soldiers. If the Crusader knights couldn't break the shield wall with their initial charge, they'd find themselves fighting dismounted against warriors who specialized in close quarters combat with axes and swords. The psychological factor can't be ignored either. Crusader knights, for all their skill and equipment, were rational soldiers who valued their lives and fought with disciplined tactics. Vikings, especially berserkers, were essentially weaponized madmen who fought with a fury that could break enemy morale even when they were losing the tactical battle. But there's another crucial factor: numbers and logistics. Crusader armies were massive, well-organized military expeditions with professional command structures, siege equipment, and supply lines. Viking raids were typically smaller, faster operations designed to strike quickly and escape before organized resistance could form. In a large-scale battle, the Crusaders' superior organization and equipment would probably give them the edge. Their heavy cavalry could potentially shatter Viking formations, while their crossbowmen and professional infantry could wear down Viking warriors from a distance. However, and this is a big however, Vikings had one advantage that could change everything. They were absolutely unpredictable. Crusader tactics were based on disciplined, coordinated maneuvers that worked against other organized armies. Vikings didn't fight like organized armies. They fought like packs of predators, using terrain, weather, and psychological warfare in ways that could completely disrupt conventional military thinking. Vikings were also masters of choosing when and where to fight. They wouldn't stand in an open field and trade blows with heavily armored knights. They'd use hit-and-run tactics, night attacks, ambushes, and guerrilla warfare that could negate the Crusaders' technological advantages. The real question isn't just who would win a single battle, it's what kind of campaign each side would fight. Crusaders were designed for conquering and holding territory through overwhelming force. Vikings were designed for raiding and escaping before their enemies could respond effectively. In a straight-up stand-up fight on an open battlefield, the Crusaders probably take it. Their superior armor, training, and organization would eventually overcome Viking fury and skill. The combination of heavy cavalry, professional infantry, and siege equipment would be too much for even the most motivated Viking warriors to handle. But in a guerrilla campaign, raids, ambushes, psychological warfare, Vikings might actually have the advantage. Their mobility, their knowledge of difficult terrain, and their complete disregard for conventional tactics could make them incredibly difficult for a conventional army to pin down and defeat. Here's the brutal truth, though. Both of these warrior cultures were incredibly dangerous for the same basic reason. They took fighting seriously in ways that most modern people can't even imagine. Vikings spent their entire lives preparing for glorious death in battle. Crusaders spent their entire lives training to be the perfect killing machines. Either group would absolutely destroy any modern military unit in hand-to-hand combat. We're talking about warriors whose physical conditioning, weapon skills, and psychological preparation were honed through years of actual warfare against equally skilled opponents. The Vikings had advantages in ferocity, unpredictability, and psychological warfare. They were masters of terror tactics, who could break enemy morale before the actual fighting even began. Their willingness to die for glory made them incredibly dangerous opponents who couldn't be intimidated or demoralized through conventional means. The Crusaders had advantages in equipment, training, and organization. They were professional soldiers with access to the finest military technology of their era, backed by sophisticated command structures and logistical systems that could sustain military operations across vast distances. But ultimately, the answer to who would win depends on the circumstances of the fight. In a large-scale set-piece battle with both sides at full strength, Crusaders probably win through superior equipment and organization. In a series of raids and ambushes where mobility and unpredictability matter more than heavy armor, Vikings might actually come out on top. The most honest answer is this: it would be close. Incredibly, brutally, horrifyingly close. Both warrior cultures represented the absolute peak of medieval military effectiveness within their respective specializations. Vikings perfected the art of psychological warfare and lightning-fast raids. Crusaders perfected the art of heavy cavalry and professional military organization. Put them against each other, and you'd get the most epic, bloody, and decisive medieval battle in history. What we can say for certain is that whoever won would pay an enormous price for victory. Both Vikings and Crusaders were warriors who knew how to make their enemies bleed, even while dying. Any battle between them would be a mutual slaughter that would go down in legend. The survivors would remember it as the day two different visions of medieval warfare met and tried to destroy each other. And regardless of who technically won, both warrior cultures would probably respect their opponents as the only enemies they'd ever faced, who were truly worthy of their steel. That's what makes this hypothetical battle so fascinating. We're not just talking about who had better weapons or tactics. We're talking about a clash between two completely different philosophies of what it meant to be a warrior in the medieval world. Vikings believed in dying gloriously for personal honor and a place in Valhalla. Crusaders believed in dying gloriously for God and the salvation of their souls. Both were willing to pay the ultimate price for their beliefs, and both had spent centuries proving just how deadly that willingness could make them. In the end, the real answer to Vikings versus Crusaders might be that medieval Europe was lucky these two warrior cultures never met at their respective peaks. The resulting battle would have been so catastrophically violent that it might have changed the entire course of European history. And honestly, that might have been the most medieval outcome of all.